Well, welcome to the 700 Club. After a slow start, the White House says deportation of some illegal immigrants is underway. ICE is expected to target about 2,000 people in 10 cities this week.
Christians across the country are making their voices heard on this issue. As Amber Strong shows us, their responses fall on both sides of the political divide.
The mass deportation numbers were lower than expected from ICE on Sunday, and while some have denounced the removal process, the administration contends they're all part of everyday operations.
It shows how far we've fallen that it's even news that ICE is doing its job.
But Democrats say when it comes to this president, it's about politics, not people.
If he wanted to really try to deport people that were security risks, maybe he shouldn't have told them a week ago. He does this because he wants to create wedges.
ICE officials plan to detain about 2,000 illegal immigrants with final deportation orders from judges.
It starts on Sunday, and they're going to take people out, and they're going to bring them back to their countries.
Those numbers came up short, thanks in part to advice from immigration rights groups.
People need to be prepared and know that they do not have to open the door.
Meanwhile, over the weekend, massive protest. In Colorado, an American flag at an ICE detention center replaced by a Mexican flag. In Washington state, a man was shot and killed by police after throwing incendiary devices at an immigration center. Across the country, Christians are getting involved in various ways. In Houston and LA, some churches are responding by providing sanctuary to illegal immigrants. Speaker Nancy Pelosi is calling on evangelicals to intervene with the White House.
They put him in office, and they have a better voice for this.
Reverend Franklin Graham tells CBN News his organization is providing assistance to churches along the border, working to ease the humanitarian crisis.
We're there to do what we can. We're not politicians. We don't make the laws. We don't make these policies. Other people do, but we're there trying to help the people.
That's why he and other leaders are calling on Congress to step up.
The onus is not on Pennsylvania Avenue. It's on Capitol Hill.
Pastor Tony Suarez, a member of the President's Evangelical Council, has pushed back against plans for widespread deportations, but says the answer to the crisis lies with Congress.
If we want to see an end to the threat or the fear in our community, what needs to happen is that Congress and the Senate need to sit down and they need to put something on the president's desk.
Now, those ICE operations are expected to continue throughout the week with an uptick in deportations as people return to work Monday. Amber Strong, CBN News, Washington.
I confess that I don't understand the protests over this one. You're talking about 2,000 people that have already exhausted judicial review. That means their cases have been heard and it has been adjudicated that they don't have a right to be in the country. So they've gone through the process and now it's time for them to leave. And apparently they're not leaving voluntarily, and so ICE has to step in. That's their job. That's their job under the law. If you don't like it, then you need to change the law. This isn't something that you make campaign hay out of to say, well, they're targeting and it's racial and all of these things. Of course it's racial. These are people from other countries. So to deport them means you're enforcing the law, which is what the administration is required to do. If you don't like it, you need to pass another law that says there's another process for either applying for asylum or applying for citizenship or applying for residency, and make a pathway so people can stay here legally. That's the solution here. We elected people to Congress, to the Senate, and to the executive branch not to continue campaigning, but to actually govern. In other news, the president is coming under fire for controversial tweets over the weekend. John Jessup has more on that story from our CBN News Bureau in Washington. John?
That's right, Gordon. Democrats are condemning President Trump for weekend tweets targeting progressive Democrat congresswomen. The first tweet claims the representatives come from other countries and calls on them to go back and help fix the totally broken and crime-infested places from which they came. The tweet's apparent targets, Representatives Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, and Ayanna Pressley all are outspoken critics of the president. Representative Omar came to the U.S. from Somalia as a child, but the rest were born in the United States and are racial minorities. Ocasio-Cortez is Puerto Rican, Tlaib is of Palestinian descent, and Presley is African American. Democrats labeled the president's tweet racist. Speaker Nancy Pelosi, who has publicly disagreed with the congresswoman on several issues, called the tweets xenophobic. The president responded that it's, quote, sad to see Democrats sticking up for people who speak so badly of our country, and also accused the congresswoman of hating Israel. Well, Speaker Pelosi and Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin are working to raise the debt limit before Congress's August recess. According to Fox News, the two spoke over the phone and exchanged letters over the weekend. Mnuchin wants Congress to raise the debt limit immediately out of concern the government could run out of cash before Congress returns in September. Pelosi reportedly is working to secure a broader spending deal. Many in Congress don't want to go on record increasing the debt limit. Well, Gulf Coast residents escaped massive flooding predicted from Hurricane Barry. The storm barely hit hurricane status for a short time and didn't drop the deluge of rain officials warned it might. But as Mark Martin explains, people in the Gulf and those still in the path of the storm are being warned not to let their guard down.
While the Gulf Coast did not suffer the catastrophic flooding many feared, residents across the area are still advised to pay attention to tornado and flash flood warnings as the storm moves north.
Much of the southern portion of the state is still experiencing heavy rainfall and that could lead to flash flooding. And we're at an elevated risk for tornadic activity.
Officials downgraded Barry to a tropical depression from a tropical storm on Sunday afternoon, but Edwards stressed it is still something to watch closely.
And so we continue to stress what we said yesterday, and that is not to let your guard down and become too complacent too soon. Remain vigilant and pay attention and watch the advisories that come out.
Edwards says he's extremely grateful Barry did not produce the devastating floods that forecasters predicted. New Orleans Mayor LaToya Cantrell also expressed relief.
We absolutely made it through the storm. Beyond lucky, we were spared. It seemed as those bands moved closer to New Orleans, it seemed to just go around us.
The Coast Guard did have to rescue people and pets from flooded areas south of New Orleans. A spokesperson says they rescued some from rooftops. Take a look at this video, which shows the Coast Guard airlifting a 77-year-old man with a dog after officials say his home took on 4 feet of water. This store owner in New Iberia, Louisiana, says Barry flooded his building with more than a foot of water, ruining furniture and computer equipment. Still, Governor Edwards says the main levees on the Mississippi River did not fail and were expected to hold up through the storm.
Flood watches are out from Louisiana all the way up into Missouri here. Also, the flood warnings, places that have seen recent torrential downpours. And there's also the possibility of a few more storms that could spin up into brief tornadoes. There could be some localized wind damage moving up into the Mid-South for today.
PowerOutage.us reported more than 50,000 customers in Louisiana and more than 4,000 customers in Mississippi were without power early Monday. Mark Martin, CBN News.
Thanks, Mark. Officials are still investigating the cause of the blackout that plunged 72,000 residents in Midtown Manhattan into the dark over the weekend. They say it was not a cyber attack or an act of terrorism. The power went out at about 6:47 Saturday evening and stayed off until about midnight. Times Square went dark, Broadway shows were canceled, and a Jennifer Lopez concert was forced to end early. It also disrupted transportation, with several subway stations forced to close, and people on more than 400 elevators were stuck between floors. Fortunately, there were no injuries. Well, Delaware Democratic Senator Chris Coons, a key faith leader on Capitol Hill, is challenging his fellow Democrats to be more open about sharing their religious beliefs. His latest invitation made in an op-ed in The Atlantic magazine. CBN News Capitol Hill correspondent Abigail Robertson spoke with Coons about his new faith initiative.
Senator Chris Coons believes Democrats have been too cautious over the years about sharing their faith values and how it influences their political views. Now he believes it's time for a change.
This is an overwhelmingly religious country.
Coons says that while many associate religion with the conservative right, polls show about 3/4 of Democrats identify as religious or somewhat religious.
And since most Americans get through their day, get through their challenges in faith, for us to hide the fact that it's an important part of our lives as Democrats would leave an unanswered question for millions of Americans who would find it hard to be comfortable with us hard to trust us if they think we are not in some way moved or grounded in faith.
While Coons strongly differs from his conservative colleagues on issues like abortion, he looks for other opportunities.
I personally work for moments where there's common purpose rather than division rooted in our differences in faith.
He believes there are other issues where faith informs and influences his stance.
Working against human trafficking, working on criminal justice reform, working to improve the environment are things that have brought together the whole range of our faith communities across the United States.
While campaigning with his colleague, Senator Sherrod Brown.
And I said I got to know him better when we were in a prayer group, a reflection group together. And I could see, looking out at the audience, dozens of people sort of, because that's not something Sherrod ever talks about.
Eventually, Brown changed that stance.
What you did for those who seemed less important, you did for me.
And cited a passage from Matthew on his election night speech.
I think it's valuable to show people our hearts, those of us who are in public service.
Coons has encouraged many 2020 Democrat presidential candidates have already discussed their faith.
It's quite a change, I think, from previous cycles.
Noting quite a few are regulars in the weekly bipartisan prayer breakfast. Coons says if you look back at our nation's history, some of the greatest movements were centrally inspired by people of faith. And he thinks more great work can be done if elected officials would focus more on things that can bring Americans together. Reporting from Capitol Hill, Abigail Robertson, CBN News.
Thanks, Abigail. Gordon Coons has a good message there.
He's got a great message, and it's one I've been saying for years, that it's time for Christians in the Democratic Party to stand up. We need to change a verse from the Bible. There's neither Jew nor Greek, Democrat or Republican, but we're all one in Christ. What's going to bring our nation together? If we keep going down this road of division, and the polarization is getting absolutely incredible. I never thought I'd see it in my lifetime. This is where you can't even negotiate. You can't even come to any kind of agreement. You can't come up with a compromise bill. And from that, you can't govern. We are going to be a nation divided. How can we come together? Well, there's a wonderful place you can come together, and that is at the foot of the cross and at the communion table, and recognize we're all made in the image of God, and we're all dependent upon Him for everything. Christians have that unique ability. If you're not a believer, you can't come into that. But if you're a Christian, you can. And so it's time for them to stand up and be recognized so that we can come together.